All right, Dr. Jen, welcome back. How are you?
I'm doing great today, Paul. How are you?
I'm doing great. As I probably say almost every month that we have these, it's usually one of the highlights of my month,
Oh,
especially
I
as
love
we're
hearing
recording
it.
this in early June. And I'm not sure about your guys', you're out in California, I'm in Michigan, school schedules, but we're starting to wind down. I think we have like a week left, like next week's our last week. And it's like you get through May and all the chaos with spring sports and activities, and then to June and trying to wrap things up, and it's like kids just are already checked out.
It's so true. Yeah, my younger son has one more day of school and my older one has three. So we're right there in the big shift into summer and all of the chaos that comes with that, but it's
Yeah,
exciting.
that's a life transition in and of itself that like happens like every year. I feel like,
Mhm.
especially like early on, like we're trying to get your like summer seed legs, I guess. And this year will be a little bit different for us because our triplets are a little bit older and they'll have more activities, which will make it difficult. And then I still have a younger one that will be complaining probably every day that they're bored. Um, that's probably a good lead into what we're going to talk about today with processing internal and external um, thoughts and conversations, different communication styles. And I was actually thinking about something similar to this because I've people have asked me often, like when they hear the two of us talking on the show. I mean, obviously they know now what you do as a therapist. They know what I do as a financial planner or financial advisor. And it's still like this interesting question that comes up, like I really enjoy what you guys talk about. It's really meaningful, really helpful, but it just seems different that a therapist and advisor get together. And one of the reasons I think why our conversations go so well and are so successful is that when you look at like any stat, pretty much one of the leading causes of divorce in couples is money. And that's one of the reasons why we first met over a year and a half ago, and now how we've kept this up, having you on like every month and really trying to deep dive into things we're going to talk about today that from a financial standpoint, you may not think that helps, but it really does, like behind the scenes, because you have to go a few layers deep to try to get on the same page with your spouse or partner on all things financial, parenting, just your relationship, on its own. And I think that's one of the magic strings that we seem to pull on with every conversation and try to find something to give to the audience on how they can help improve their relationships with not only their spouse, their partner, their kids, but then how does that help from a financial standpoint and from a personal standpoint as well.
Yeah, I do find myself thinking that one of the things that you and I both do is we talk with people about things that are very vulnerable and, not things that they necessarily talk about with their friends or with everybody else in their family or, just acquaintances that, someone coming to you for financial advice, investment, life planning, trusts, and all of these things that we do. It's incredibly vulnerable. It's really open and it can be really scary, those topics. And, similarly with me, seven, eight, nine times a day, someone says to me, I've never told anybody this before. I've never talked about this. Or couples will say, I can't believe we're talking about this with someone outside of our relationship. And it really is a precious, amazingly special place that we hold. And I know we aren't the only careers that get to do that, but we certainly are in a very very unique and tender position with the people we work with.
Did that when you were getting into the field, did that resonate with you? Because when I was getting into the field, 15, 20 years ago, like this wasn't a thing. Like what we talk about today, emotions and feelings around your personal life and your financial life just wasn't a thing. Like people just like advisor, numbers, stocks, bonds, retirement, college planning, the hardness about it. But now today there's more, I think, softness around the edges, and it's really probably the most important part of this changing field that I'm in. But I'm wondering, what was that like for you?
Hmm. Yeah. It's been an interesting journey. I have noticed a little bit of that softening, and it's always hard to tease out, is that because I'm now 20 years into my career and that just people kind of settle in a little bit differently or quicker, or is the kind of the general sense in the world kind of softening into, wow, we really do need to take care of our emotions and our relationships. I hope that's what's happening. And I think, maybe in some communities that might be happening faster than in others, but I am noticing that shift, at least in where I am in Northern California, that there is more and more openness to, really looking at the function of emotions and what is the information that we're getting, and can this relationship actually support us in a different way?
So one of the things that you mentioned that we wanted to talk about today, because kind of have my lead in, and then I sidetracked us, was something that's been coming up with a lot of the couples that you work with this communication style, being able to process things internally and externally. So can you lead us off on what that exactly means, and how each of us, whether spouse or partners, have these differing communication styles, and how we try to work with each other to get on the same page to probably reduce conflict.
It will absolutely reduce conflict. Yeah, it's so interesting. I was just talking with three couples about the same concept yesterday. It comes up all the time in the couples therapy sessions that I do. And, pulling back a little bit, what we're kind of talking about relates to, in general, the sense of introversion and extroversion, which I know are words that most of us understand and have heard. And those are often a little bit reductionistic. Most people aren't only introverted or only
Right.
extroverted. We're often kind of a blend of those. And even so, we do tend to have a primary style, most of us. And an introverted style tends to be, not just that people like spending time alone, that can be part of introversion. It's also how they regain their energy, how they reset and regroup, that there's this solitude that can be really, really fulfilling and really healing. And there's a processing style that comes along with it. So I'll park that there for a second. Introversion versus extroversion, right? Extroversion is more, that I might gain energy or, feel more fulfilled or feel like I can heal in the presence of others. And having that energy, that social connection might be what I need if I'm really struggling or if I need to regroup or reset. So each of those, if we kind of take that as a reductionist concept and think of those as the ends of a spectrum, they're also going to come with a way of processing information. And so introverted information processing, or we can think of a kind of internal processing, is that people are going to want to collect information, think about it for a while. I always use this image of kind of polishing up your thought and presenting it as a completed, formed idea that you have worked really hard on. And here's what I think about this thing. Whereas more of an external processor, extroverted processing, which is me, I fully acknowledge, and I'm happy to give you some examples of how this has shown up in my relationship, is I need to hear myself talk in order to process things, right? I will say stream of consciousness things. It might be why we enjoy podcasting, is because there's this external, gosh, now that I hear myself say that, I also have this thought and this thought. And as we process externally, we will find ourselves eventually coming to, and this is what I think about that. So it's the same thing that's happening. For one person, it's really internal. For the other person, it's very external. Fine, right? No problem. Except that we tend to be drawn to people in relationship who are the opposite.
The opposites. I was just going to ask you that.
hmm Not always, but often we're drawn to the opposite in so many aspects of relationships.
Is that
And
a? Can I interrupt you for a
of
second?
course,
Because is that like, how does that happen? Is that like some kind of like subconscious thing? Because I that just
it
without like
must
getting
be.
like really personal, like with Teresa and I, like there are so many things that we are like. How did we end up making it this far? Almost 20 years of, well, over 20 years of being together, almost 19 years of marriage. And like, how, how?
Isn't that funny? I think it's very unconscious. I think quite literally there's a genetic piece to it that, on a genetic level, we know we will have healthy children if we have slightly different gene pool from each other. And so we tend to be unconsciously attracted to something that is different than us. not too different, right? Because we also need to agree and, fundamentally have life values that
Yeah.
coincide with each other. And yet, we do often find couples who are, almost placed on the ends of spectrums, or we can say, okay, so sometimes I say, take what you think you would do and just assume the opposite for your partner, because it really may be that simple sometimes. So this processing style, we can kind of start to imagine how that could act itself out in a couple. And I will give you an example from my marriage. My husband and I laugh about this all the time, where years and years ago we used to work together, and he is much more of an internal processor than I am. And we would be talking and there would be a pause, and he would just get up and leave and go take care of some activity or something that he realized he had to do and come back in a while. And I would say, "Where did you go?"
Like,
And he's,
what the
"Oh,"
heck just happened?
right? "Oh, I realized I had time to do that thing or have that meeting or have that conversation that was worrying me, and so I just went and did it." And for me, I would think, "Oh my goodness, if that were me, I would have said, you know what I just remembered? I have to have this conversation with someone. I'll be back in about 5 minutes, and remind me when I come back to do this thing and that thing and that thing." Right? I would have narrated the entire process externally. And neither is better, although we often think our own personal style is better. And so, where this can really start to cause problems with couples is when we assume that, for example, if I'm an external processor and my partner is an internal processor, I might, if I don't understand this concept or haven't thought about this, I might assume that my partner's silence means that they're upset. Or I might assume that the long pauses when I present something means that he doesn't care or he doesn't like my idea. Or I might assume that when he shares something with me, that it's one of 10 ideas and we can keep talking about it and we'll eventually converge on what we want, because that's how my mind works. But it's not what's happening internally for him. So after years and years of being married to someone who's an internal processor, I now understand that his silences are because he's really thinking about what I said and processing it and pondering it and rolling it over and deciding how he thinks about it. And that when he shares something with me, we've worked on this, so he shares more with me now, and I narrate what's happening for me more now. And we'll talk about how to work with that. But I used to assume that he would share something with me, I could share something with him, and we'd both kind of bounce it around. And now I understand that if he's sharing something with me, it's actually a very precious thing that might be feeling vulnerable because he's worked so hard on it
Yeah, I
internally.
was gonna say he's put a lot of thought into that.
Exactly. So if I just dismiss it the way I might dismiss one of my 8,000 thoughts that comes out of my mouth, that might feel really hurtful for him because
Hmm.
it's decided, right? He likes that thought. For me, it's just one of many thoughts. And then on the inverse, and we can talk about even more ways that this can trip us up. For me, doing all of my external processing, one of the things that used to happen is I would throw out an idea, intending to throw out 10 more ideas, and he would say, "Oh, I don't think that's going to work." And I would feel shut down or invalidated because it was just an idea and I have many other ideas and I needed to be able to hear myself talk about them. But he was getting worried because he thought that was my one precious idea that I was ready to
Mm,
present him,
yeah.
and it didn't feel like the right idea to him. So we can kind of stumble into assumptions because we think that that person's processing the way we are, and he might think that, the way that I responded means what it would mean for him, but it's often quite the opposite.
And I don't know if we've talked about this before, if I've given this example, but I've noticed like with Teresa and I, like there's a lot of times when she just wants to talk, mainly like kind of to vent,
Hmm.
and and me trying to figure out, okay, do I need to just listen here, or do I need to try to solve that problem that she's like talking about? Is
Hmm.
is this like, am I close to it, or is this in the same ballpark of of relating back to what you're talking about?
It really can be. Yeah. So, oftentimes that need to vent is, for someone who processes externally, it is
Yeah, that
literally.
would be an example of processing externally.
Right, exactly. So, maybe her venting in those situations is she really just needs to be able to hear herself talk through this. And, it's one of the reasons why psychotherapy is so effective is we hear ourselves say the things that we're
Mm.
saying rather than simply thinking them. And it's this very private thought that sometimes actually literally hearing ourselves say it changes how we think about it, or it allows us to say, oh, that's not exactly what I think, or let me work on that or reframe that. And so, to your point, it can be challenging if we're doing that and our partner or our friend says, oh, you know what you should do about that is, or, here's what I think, or have you considered this thing? It can actually feel, our favorite word, invalidating, right? Because here I am, just I need to, maybe I need you to hear me, or I need myself to hear myself. And yet it's getting short circuited with advice. And then I think the other thing that can happen with that writing reflex, that kind of fixing reflex that we all get because we love our partners and we don't want them to be suffering, is it can make them feel like maybe we don't see them as fully competent.
Mm.
If I'm processing or
Yeah.
venting this challenge and it takes you 10 seconds to say, oh, you know what you should do, it would be easy for that subtext to come in. Does he think I'm stupid? Of course I've thought of that. Or, how can you know what I should do 10 seconds in when I'm really struggling with this problem? So I really do recommend, and it doesn't have to be just the recipient of these conversations. It is even better to some extent if it's the Teresa in that situation, to say, I'd really like to tell you about my day. I'm not looking for advice. I just kind of need you to hear what's going on, or to kind of frame what we're looking for in conversations. Sometimes we are looking for advice, and I really need your support or your help on this. And sometimes we literally do not want the support, or, well, we want support, but we don't want advice, or we don't want, recommendations necessarily. And if we can say that up front, it can save a lot of heartache and a lot of the defensiveness that can come up when we're getting unsolicited advice.
And listening to you explain that, going back to what you said earlier, it's like we have one predominant style, if you will, introvert versus extrovert. But then you also said that there's times where like we're not, if we're extrovert, we're not extrovert all the time. And so I can see where that can be confusing for our spouses or partners because they may know us like, talking out loud, and then all of a sudden like when we decide to flip that switch and do something deeply reflective or think internally and there's silence, then that probably raises a red flag like, okay, what's wrong?
That's right. Yeah. And I want to just hold that question for a second because it's one of the
Okay.
most triggering questions that we can ask our partner. What's wrong? It's interesting. We want to be supportive, and sometimes when we say what's wrong, we mean it sincerely. I think something's wrong. What's wrong with you? But what we often hear is you
Negative
aren't
connotation.
acting the right way, right? What's
Yeah.
wrong? Why are you looking like that? Why are you acting like that? Why are you saying those things as though you shouldn't be, right? There's kind of a should hidden in
Yes.
there. You should be
Yeah.
different than you are right now. And so, in
Because I
general,
when I think about that, like I know personally, I get pretty defensive, and so
yes.
then I'd like fire up like right away,
Mm-hmm.
and I've seen this in families that I've worked with on the financial side. This comes up because, like we talked about, more than likely, not they're both not on the same page. It's very seldom that I work with a couple or a partnership that has it all figured out because that's why they're talking to me and likely why they're talking to you.
Exactly, exactly. And if you think about it, and you're right on, Paul, we typically become defensive when someone says what's wrong. For you, can you think of why that makes you feel defensive?
Ooh, that's a good one. Probably because it probably has to do with a lack of respect
Mm.
to some degree where that I don't know.
I think you're right. It feels disrespectful, which is so interesting because my guess is that that's probably not that person's intention at
Right,
all.
exactly.
And I think it feels disrespectful because we don't like to be told how we feel.
Hmm.
It's invalidating,
Yes.
right? And
Yeah.
invalidation and disrespect, they feel really similar. So when someone says what's wrong, or even worse, I can tell you're upset, we kind of get in this position of no, I'm not, or I have a right to be, right? We feel like we have to defend that feeling. And so what I recommend instead is actually a very subtle shift. We can still check in, saying something like, I noticed that your face changed. Did something happen? Or I'm telling myself a story that you're upset right now. What's going on? And that phrasing, I'm telling myself a story, is something that all of the couples I work with have started practicing saying to each other, because it gives just that momentary pause and acknowledgement that I don't actually know what's happening inside your head and your body. I'm telling myself a story that I want to check out with you, and I'm willing to hear your honest feedback about what actually is happening. We don't have to say all of that. We can just say, "Hey, I want to check in with you. Are you doing okay? Right? I noticed something shift." And if our partner says, "No, I'm fine," we have to believe them, or we have to at least act as though we believe them, because they're the only judge of their emotions. And just like we talked about in the podcast about make sureing, if you decide not to tell me how you're feeling, you can, and that's up to you. And I need to go with that. And maybe you don't get the support you need. And hopefully in the future, you do tell me honestly what you're feeling. And it's just never going to be my job to say, no, I can tell you're mad. Because we can make someone get mad if we keep saying that. Well, I wasn't, but now I am, right?
Right. Yeah.
So it's an interesting, and kind of coming back to that internal processor, that's sometimes where I see the friction with couples, where someone in my position, more of an external processor, I'm going to say all of those emotions out loud. I'm a little frustrated today, and I'm a little bit bored, or I'm noticing that around noon I had this big spike of anxiety. I'm going to narrate all of that experience. And that's part of my currency. That's part of how I connect with people who I love, my friends, my partner, is by sharing all those details about my internal world. And so I might then want to get that back from them. But when I say to an internal processor, I can tell you're upset, then it's going to take all of that time for them to process, well, how am I really feeling? What was I feeling a second ago before you said that? Do I need to explain why I'm upset? Is that an expectation? And we put them on their heels when we've really been trying to offer support. And so we can get into a lot of friction with that, where couples end up saying, what just happened? I don't know. We weren't upset with each other, and now we are. And all that happened was I thought we were checking in about
Right.
how your day was or something.
Oh, that is so good because I mean that to me is really relatable where you think you're just having a nice conversation or just like giving an update and then all of a sudden within like minutes or even seconds it like completely goes off the rails. It's like what the heck just happened here? Like
Mhm.
this was not my intent at all.
Right, right. An example that came up in one of the couple sessions that I did just yesterday. It's a newer couple I'm working with, and we were talking about this exact phenomenon, because one of them is very clearly internally processing and the other is very clearly externally processing. I can tell because I'm hearing more from one person than the other, right? And the kind of like, well, what do you think? Yeah, I'd like to hear from you, right? The kind of turning to each other, trying to pull information. And so we started talking about this concept, and the external processor in that couple said, this just happened in the car on the way over. So, I hear about this story, and essentially what happened was the external processor was, regaling the other with details about their day before, and kind of, isn't this interesting? I got together with a group of friends, and you got together with a different group of friends, and what do you think about that? Followed by a long pause. And then the internal processor said something like, oh, that's really interesting. And then another long pause. And then the external processor gave lots more information, asked a few more questions, long pauses. Yeah, great. That's interesting. And then the rest of the ride was had in silence. They had very, very different experiences of that conversation. So the external processor came away from that conversation feeling really disconnected, worried that something was wrong because the internal processor had been so quiet,
Right. Yeah.
feeling that silence and just kind of bubbling up, like, what's wrong? This is silence. I don't like this. This is really uncomfortable, 'cause silence can be really uncomfortable for us.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that. Like sometimes, like just the pure silence is really uncomfortable.
Yep.
It-
And the internal processor had no idea that that conversation was uncomfortable for the external processor. They meant what they said. That's interesting. They found it interesting, and so they said that. And they didn't have anything else to add, and so they didn't say anything else. And then they sat happily in silence for the rest of the car ride. And
because
yet that was not the understanding.
Yeah, that's I think one of my biggest challenges when I'm working with families is dealing dealing with, sometimes embracing that awkward silence because if we're knee deep talking about something like very important like some financial related manner, maybe spending versus saving. We had a nice long discussion on that one a few weeks ago. And you could tell, and this is another thing I was gonna wanted to come back and bring up to you, like the people's body language. Sometimes their body language says more than their words, and especially during these moments of pause or silence. And so it's been a skill I've been trying to develop on knowing when to let that pause work and let that partner or spouse or couple pick up the lead and drive if that's the right word. Does that make sense?
Mhm. It does, and you're right. So much is nonverbal, and at some point we'll talk a little bit more. I know we've briefly mentioned the Gottman Four Horsemen, and we'll come back to those another time. And the reason I bring them up here is that some of the nonverbal things can relay really important information, even up to the concept of contempt. So a nonverbal that is so painful is something like an eye roll,
Oh, I knew you were gonna say
crossed
that.
arms, right?
I get that from Teresa like all the time. Like she knows. I'm like, oh shoot. And the thing is, like most of the time, I don't mean to do it. It's like one of those like subconscious things that I just not a very good poker player.
Right. And you probably process more externally, right? We're going to see it
Yes.
on our faces, and I doubt you feel contemptuous. And yet sometimes when we have that expression, or maybe we're reacting to something internally for us that might not have everything to do with our partner or the conversation we're having, we're going to read those facial expressions and that body language. And what we see in the research is that we actually put more emphasis and weight on the body language than we do on the words that are said. That tends to matter more. We can say exactly the same words with a crossed arms, disengaged, eye rolling state, or with an open, relaxed, connected state, and it's going to land incredibly differently, or we're going to take different meaning from it.
Yeah, it's funny. Somebody once told me that watches the show on our YouTube channel. He's like, you talk a lot with your face. Like never heard that one before, but I can agree.
I do too. Yeah. And I think we often are conveying so much more than we realize, which is another reason it can feel so scary, and we can get so defended when we are told how we feel, or we're told how we're coming across. And it can be really frightening actually for us, because that's not our self-concept. Or we thought we had good intentions, or we're coming at somebody with love or compassion, and we're being told that we came out with aggression, or with a lot of heat behind us. And so that idea of, I'm telling myself a story, that is such a gift of love, really. And I do talk so much with couples about that idea of giving each other a gift, or an act of love, that finding ways, even just having taken the time to name some of these dynamics, like, wow, I tend to process more externally, you tend to process more internally. When we can start to name that, or I always talk about narrating, when we can narrate our process a little bit more, and I know I'm asking introverted processors to be willing to do something out of their comfort zone with this, that it is an act of love. And so now when my partner is willing to share things with me, or if I say, hey, how are you thinking and feeling about this decision that's coming up? We just had this happen a couple weeks ago where I was so overjoyed that he was willing to share with me, I'm kind of feeling two ways about this, and I'm not sure if I want to do it this way or that way, which is very rare for an internal processor. And then at the end, he said, this is me processing externally. And it really it brought tears to my eyes because I knew that, and yet I hadn't quite
Wow.
clicked into what an effort he was making to do that. And it's an act of love, right? He's speaking my language. And so I do think of it as kind of this language barrier sometimes where it's almost like an external processor is speaking Japanese and internal processor is speaking French. And so we're becoming bilingual. We're trying to speak each other's languages. And in the reverse, I can say, I'm going to need to process externally for a few minutes and I'm going to run out a bunch of ideas and please don't weigh in on any of them until I'm done with this because I just kind of need to get it out of my system. And that's such a relief for my partner who can kind of stand down on the, oh no, do I have to decide about this right now? Oh, I'm just receiving. I'm just listening and I can, give that act of love or she's shown me love by reminding herself that this might be stressful for me to hear this barrage of words coming at me.
So my takeaway from what you just said, really the last few things you just mentioned, and the entire conversation, is that these relationships, these marriages, these partnerships, take a lot of work, and it doesn't matter like how new you're into a relationship or how you could be in a relationship for 20 plus years, and it still requires that constant fine tuning and the word that always comes up, awareness of what's going on.
Yeah, they do. And it doesn't have to be dreary. I think the
Yes.
work that it takes, and I only seize on that word because I think sometimes we can get demoralized with, oh gosh, this takes so much work. And it does take work.
And you know
But
what? When you just said that, I'm like, I probably gave you some facial expression that that probably like, man, it takes a lot of like negative. Like,
right. And it can feel like that. It really can feel like work. And some couples therapy sessions feel really hard. And, my hope is that they usually don't. But I think of it actually much more like your world, that this is an investment. And
yes.
so when we can invest in this process, I wouldn't even say in the beginning, just once we become aware of it, and once we have that awareness, if you're listening or watching today and you're thinking, oh my goodness, my partner and I have different processing styles and we've never talked about that, have that conversation. And maybe for a few weeks or months it'll feel more like work because you're really trying to bring that into conscious awareness. And then it doesn't feel like as much work and it can just be more lighthearted. Oh, that's me being external, or I just narrated 10 things that you didn't need to hear, or oh, I just realized I didn't clue you into all of those thoughts I was having. And it becomes less and less work and more just these kind of out loud narrations of our process so that we can be connected and not have so many misunderstandings.
Well, I think that is a good place to put a pin on this conversation, and probably one, like you said, that we'll come back to probably again and again in the future. So, well, Dr. Jen, it's always a pleasure to have you on and sharing your insights, and can't thank you enough.
My pleasure, Paul. It's a great conversation.